during those years, the late 1800s up to 1913, the president of Mexico was Porfirio Diaz, and he was part Mixtec. He was from southern Mexico, from the Oaxaca area.
Mm-hmm.
And that area is, in fact, as we talk about in our book, The Crystal Skulls, that area of southern Mexico, south of Mexico City, around Monte Alban, Mitla, the main town there is Oaxaca. That area is where the Zapotecs and the Mixtecs lived, and they were the special artisans. And even the Aztec rulers used Mixtecs and Zapotec artisans. These were the jewelers. They were the gold artisans, and they were the guys too who carved crystals and made crystal skulls.
Mm.
The big question, and this is what the British Museum was looking at, the Smithsonian, the Mitchell-Hedges Skull has been studied this way, is you have these really remarkable, very large crystal skulls. And if you look at the British Museum crystal skull or the Mitchell-Hedges crystal skull, they are not only nearly life-size pieces of very pure, clear crystal, I mean almost perfectly translucent,
Mm-hmm.
Just to get a really large, almost perfectly clear crystal that size would be difficult, just for starters.
Right.
And then to actually carve it into, a life-size skull, I mean, this becomes really a job for someone who is incredibly skilled and would have to have special tools, including like diamond drills and diamond-tipped saws. And this is what they were looking at, the Smithsonian and the British Museum, as they started to look at some of these crystal skulls.
Mm-hmm.
The question that came to their mind was, well, if this is really an Aztec crystal skull, the Mitchell-Hedges crystal skull was said to be a Mayan crystal skull.
Yeah.
And they wondered, I mean, the big thing that came up with them, which they hadn't really thought of back in, 1886, when like the London British Museum crystal skull was acquired, the Paris Museum crystal skull was acquired around that same time. They said, yeah, this is an Aztec crystal skull. This is a Mayan crystal skull. But later, as they looked into how these things could be carved, what it would take to carve them, polish them, and the question that they had was, well, did the Aztecs or the Mayans actually have the tools to make these things?
Yeah.
And they kept looking for power tool marks, things like that, something that would indicate that they had been made with crude tools or advanced tools. And what they decided in the end, that the British Museum and the Smithsonian, was that the British Museum crystal skull and the Mitchell-Hedges crystal skull had been carved not with primitive tools, but with fairly modern tools.
Hmm.
And this, of course, raised a big red flag to them, because they had assumed and had, in good faith, purchased these crystal skulls in the late 1800s as authentic Aztec or perhaps Mayan, although now people do not think that there were very many Mayan crystal skulls, if any. But they started having serious doubts that those crystal skulls anyway were somehow authentic, ancient skulls that had been carved 1,000 years ago or something like that.
Very interesting. And, I would like to pick up on a few notes that you mentioned there, especially regarding Mexico, and I'm going to return to that a bit later there. But I want to mention before that in a recent story from Archaeology, that their website is archaeology.org, I think, a story written by Jane McLaren Walsh. The title of the story was Legend of the Crystal Skulls, a fairly recent story. And basically...
I saw that article, yeah.
You did, yeah. I mean, the entire subject is basically debunked in that article. Basically, I guess they refer to this because they've done testing on a few that I would guess at this point is actually a crappy few fakes of these that kind of came onto the scene during the second half of the 19th century, and they began to surface. And of course, what they determined to be a fake is those who have clear evidence of, as you say, kind of tool marks on them. But that does not necessarily mean, though, that those are fake, because if we just take into account what you mentioned, that if indeed these people back there in South America, the Mayans, Aztecs, etc., had these kinds of tools, then it doesn't mean that it's a fake, but it's actually a real thing. So is it possible, do you think, at all to determine the age of these crystal skulls at all?
Well, I mean, that's one of the problems with crystal skulls, is that because they're carved out of quartz crystal, you cannot, there's no way to really date them unless, like, you could find the origin. If you could find the maker and even like an invoice or something to somebody saying, yeah, I made this crystal skull for you, here's your bill, blah, blah, blah. They think that these crystal skulls, like the Mitchell-Hedges crystal skull, the one in the British Museum, they think now that they were made in Germany, and that they were made by, there's a couple of special towns in Germany that specialize in crystal carving.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about, say, 1860 or so. This time, they did have power tools. They had diamond drills and saws. They could cut. They could polish the skulls. And yeah, that article that you're talking about by Walsh, she works for the Smithsonian Institution, and
right.
Because of this new Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull movie that's coming out, I mean, there's already an intense interest in these skulls. By the way, I mean, one of the curious things going on here in this whole debate about the crystal skulls, who made them, how authentic they are, the one in Paris, the Parisians insist that is not a modern fake. They insist that it is an Aztec crystal skull.
Mm.
So now you have the Smithsonian and the British Museum saying, no, these things are, they're not 1,000 years old or more. They're only, maybe 150 years old, something like that.
Right.
But in Paris, they're saying, no, this is really an Aztec crystal skull. If you go to museums in Mexico, you will see crystal skulls, in the museums. The main museum in Mexico City, I was just there a couple of months ago,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a great museum. Lot of cool stuff to see and unusual things.
Right.
And you will see some crystal skulls in there. They're not life-size, though. They're much smaller, just a few inches high. They are carved out of quartz crystal. I mean, we say in our book that the Aztecs probably themselves weren't able to make crystal skulls, but the Mixtecs and Zapotecs apparently were. In my book that came out last year on the mystery of the Olmecs,
Right.
I show in that book that nearly everything that is ascribed to the Mayans, whether it's the calendar, the writing system, the number system, the building the pyramids, even the ball games and the rubber balls and things like that,